Hello, and welcome to The Charge Cycle, an electrifying new podcast on all things fleet electrification. I'm Todd Trauman, I'm the CEO of eMission Control. If you are a procurement manager, a fleet operator, or one of the millions of people tasked with a zero-emission deployment goal, this podcast is for you. We speak with industry experts, funding experts, OEMs, and many others to help you stay ahead of this enormous electrification shift underway. Hello, welcome back to another episode of The Charge Cycle, an electrifying new podcast on all things fleet electrification, or just electrification these days. We have all sorts of new stuff going on way outside of the fleet space. Todd Trauman, CEO of FuSE, formerly eMission Control here. Also right along with Connor Whaley, our OEM and Strategic Partnerships Manager. Connor, what's up?
How's it going?
Good. Actually, I think this is the first podcast we've recorded since you've become a newlywed.
That's true. Yeah, I got married just a few months ago, so this is the first time since actually going on our honeymoon.
All right. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And good luck.
I'm going to need it. Thank you.
Also, super excited to bring on Elaine O'Byrne to the podcast today. Hi, Elaine.
Hi, Todd.
Elaine is the Director of Operations here at FuSE and is probably the foremost expert at a lot of our regulatory program administration. So we not only on the operations side of things, but on the regulatory affairs side of things, has her operational hat on and her regulatory affair fingers up in all of the different particular programs along the West Coast and Canada. So Elaine, really happy to have you here.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Just the wider masses don't quite know the name or the face yet. Give us the quick spiel on you.
Well, yeah. How long do we have? But so Elaine O'Byrne. I had the opportunity to join FuSE about 3.5 years ago now, which is kind of wild. And prior to that, I was working for a large contingent workforce management company, which is also another niche, highly regulated space. Anything to do with employment law would be. But in that capacity, I was working in our business analytics side, so I had some really large clients there. And after a few years, and I think just the kind of working from home, I during the pandemic decided that I wanted a change, and one thing I was really excited about in that job hunt was finding formerly again eMission Control, an actual startup here in Sacramento. I'm from Sacramento, and so I think it's really exciting to have new companies kind of bring fresh ideas to the area. We always have that kind of tug and pull with Silicon Valley or the Bay Area for the type of talent that we have and just the new companies forming, and to have that happening in my hometown is really exciting. So when I got connected with Todd the summer of 2020, it was really just very small new company with a very different kind of website, talking about forklifts and this LCFS program, which I had never heard of, and really just diving into a world I was super unfamiliar with. So I did not obviously come from an EV background. I knew very little about zero emission off-road vehicles or the concept of a commercial fleet. Transportation and logistics or supply chain, all these things that are so interconnected. That was something I definitely didn't appreciate at the time. And I was very lucky to have great mentors and Todd and the rest of the team, all 5 of us at the time. And I think the kind of relative simplicity of, our business and these programs, even just a few short years ago, I was able to ramp up pretty quickly. Very early on, being the first operations team hire, I was liaising right away with our clients and obviously handling quarterly reporting and all these, numbers and getting very close to the data. And I think, that helped me understand early on just, how do fleets operate? What kinds of equipment do they have? But really importantly, how does a kilowatt hour become a clean fuel program credit? And then ultimately, how do those credits get transacted and, reinvested by our partners into their various sustainability and electrification projects. And so being on the kind of front line of that work, I got the opportunity to work with some state agency staff. I think these programs grow and change a lot, and so they've certainly faced a lot of challenges over the last few years as well, with the coming out of the pandemic and staffing up just as these programs have grown. And I've been really excited to grow alongside FuSE and our fleets that we represent and these programs. So yeah, that would be kind of the short of it, I suppose. And now I get to work with a team of 3 other dedicated ops team members, partner success. We've got our Canadian side of the business, and we really head up a lot of the regulatory affairs. And I think it ultimately comes from understanding the data and mechanics of these programs pretty well.
Yeah, well, Elaine, awesome. Really excited to have you here. I will say Elaine's done an incredible job at FuSE. We, currently do this sort of work on behalf of hundreds of companies, from small mom and pops to Fortune 50s to municipalities to transit agencies, you name it. And so our perspective is really on their behalf. And, Elaine, I think to your point, on the education front, we'll get into this, I'm sure, in a bit, but we do a lot of educating of the regulatory bodies themselves also. And so pretty interesting how we can lean our perspective into these particular rules. But for folks tuning in, today is an episode that is really actually pretty close to the chest for us. We're not talking about a specific OEM technology or any sort of other kind of tangential topic area. Today is really all about what is the state of affairs of the regulatory programs happening with clean fuel standards out here on the West Coast and in Canada. This is a big topic. It might sound a little niche on paper, but these are some of the biggest and probably arguably the most influential incentive programs out there as it relates to electrification. And again, that's stacked up against any sort of incentive, any sort of grant opportunity that you've heard of. These low carbon fuel standard style programs are extremely powerful. That said, they're extremely not very well known. And so, our job today is to really kind of talk about the meat and potatoes of that, but also get in the weeds a little bit about what's happening in California, how important that is to the other jurisdictions that are looking at California, often following suit. So excited to kind of get in the weeds here.
And I'm actually particularly excited here because I am kind of tangential to a lot of the regulatory work that you guys do. So, I have a very kind of basic understanding of what the process goes through, like, kind of schoolhouse rock level of, how the bill becomes a law and everything. I know that, but not a whole lot more. So I'm really excited to kind of hear how these different programs interact with the regulatory bodies and the legislative bodies. I know there's a whole lot of different kind of moving parts here. So I'm particularly excited to kind of hear the nitty-gritty details that you guys do kind of every single day in all these different kinds of programs.
Yeah, good point, Connor. Maybe the best way to start would actually kind of just doing a quick 30,000-foot view on the legislative side before we're getting into the regulatory side. And Elaine, we'll maybe turn to you for a quick overview of that. But, philosophically, these particular programs, they work really, really well as an opportunity to draw millions, billions of dollars, actually, out of just big oil, essentially, and into private or public enterprise that are looking to buy down costs of renewable or low carbon fuels. It's a really, really functional way of making that happen. And so as a result, there are lots of different jurisdictions now looking at these active programs, seeing how they're functioning, finding that we can really actually funnel billions of dollars out of big oil and turn it into local economies. So New Mexico, for example, active programs right now exist in California, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and in Canada federally, but they've been long been discussed on the legislative floor for quite a while. New Mexico actually just passed their own clean fuel standard. I think it's called the Clean Transportation Standard, coming into effect 2026. Also being debated on the legislative floor in Illinois, in Michigan, New Jersey, New York has had it on discussion for quite a while. So these are, again, great programs that are being debated all over the place. Hawaii, actually. And then additionally, there are several out in Europe that we haven't even really gotten our hands around yet. So an exciting opportunity for our company personally, but also, speaks to the broader global opportunity that people see for advancing the state of clean fuel transportation. That said, the devil's in the details. The details can often be the actual regulations themselves once legislative policy gets pushed through. Lots of activity, lots of spicy stuff happening out here on the West Coast. Elaine, I would love to maybe just kind of get your, broad brush perspective on just what's happening out here as far as the regulatory amendment cycle for each of these particular programs.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in order to set the scene for all of these big changes, it might be a good idea to take a step back, kind of as Connor mentioned. Most folks are familiar, again, with the kind of civics class, high school civics level of understanding of how does an idea or a bill become law. And I think going through that process might help our listeners understand a little bit of where we are in, in these different programs, in their rule makings or in their, adjustment periods. So I'm going to go ahead, if that's all right, and share my screen with a slide that we actually presented not too long ago at FuSE's kind of all-hands strategy session. Yeah, but just this is going to, again, be a super simplified version of obviously what actually happens, and this is the best case scenario. Let's say there's a little baby clean fuel standard that someone, a legislator is proposing in either the state assembly or the Senate. So the introduction of that bill, often, the very broad strokes of that are copied and pasted from other active programs. So California, really sets the scene for a lot of the work that's done in other states. So ultimately what happens, someone introduces the bill, and then that bill goes into committee review and hearings. So there are a number of expert stakeholder testimony, other folks who might be impacted, especially true when there's a fiscal impact to the state. This is really kind of where a lot of the earliest stakeholders get to contribute their feedback. And so big names, in these clean fuel programs, so obviously regulated entities themselves, the oil and gas companies would be present in a lot of these conversations. But then, of course, we've got our environmental justice groups, folks who are privy to what's happening in kind of the novel technology space for transportation. They would get called in to give that testimony. Essentially, there's this process can repeat several times, and whether or not there's enough kind of broader support for the bill, it may fizzle out there, but let's say everything goes well, that bill gets taken into a committee vote. And assuming that there's a simple majority there, the bill gets taken to the full chamber for consideration. Again, very simplified version of what actually happens. Essentially, whether it is proposed in the Senate or the Assembly, using terminology for California, that bill would move on to the other house, and the process, steps 1 through 4, would repeat. And ultimately, if both sides, the Assembly and Senate, agree, the governor has this bill land on his or her desk, and she'll sign it into law, which is what we just saw happen kind of with New Mexico. Governor Grisham.
Hi all, it's Elaine here with a quick correction regarding the governor of New Mexico. Her full name is Governor Lujan Grisham. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the podcast.
Just went ahead and signed the CTFS, Clean Transportation Fuel Standard. And now we get kicked over into the regulatory process. So that's really where Todd had mentioned the devil in the details portion. This is the initial drafting of the regulatory language. So there's a state agency, again, using New Mexico as our example. We've got New Mexico Environment Department, and they are tasked with this very difficult project of kind of writing the framework of this, of the regulation. Often this also involves tapping an advisory committee made up of industry stakeholders, similar to the folks who might have been called into some hearings, but also broadened a bit. Then we've got our notice of proposed rulemaking, which really kicks off the public comment period as well. This is the first notification to the public that there's more meat on the bones of this regulation. And this is, I think, to me, the most exciting and critical part of any of these programs. They're both at their inception and as they evolve over time, is really getting the public interested in what's going on and empowering them to participate and understand how these laws affect them. And so we at FuSE this would be the part where we feel we've had a lot of opportunity to represent our clients through written feedback, speaking at workshops, during different hearings, and sometimes getting that opportunity to have some one-on-one as a subject matter expert with the regulators and staff themselves. So let's say things, go well. The public is generally, supportive of the language, and we get into the revision and review portion. So based on public comments, staff may make changes. Hopefully they are receptive to the feedback that they get. And ultimately, that final version of the regulation is taken to the decision-making body for the department that is implementing the regulation, and they vote whether to approve or not the version of regulation, and that gets us into the implementation phase, which is really when the program goes live, when folks start signing up, and if you're a credit generator or using a renewable fuel or low carbon fuel, you generate credits, and those folks on the other side who are producing carbon intense fuels, oil and gas, generate deficits. So that is the broad strokes of how a bill becomes law, and then how that law really solidifies itself, how the public can be involved, and how we see the actual implementation of these programs that are now live in a number of US states. The purpose of these regulations is not to stay static. Obviously, public sentiment changes over time, new technologies come online, economic conditions change, and so there are a number of factors that may make the agency that is administering a program decide to issue a new rulemaking period or amendment cycle so that they can address these changes in just kind of the ecosystem and make sure that the regulation is still working as time goes on. And so these are also the times when we might see, coalitions come into play, different interest groups, and honestly, some of the infighting that I think kind of gets us to really, have to evaluate what are the priorities in these programs, what is true to their kind of most, pure intent, and who they're meant to benefit, and how they're supposed to work. So
for those listening in, Lane shared a slide that is probably one of the best overviews that would suffice for a Civics 101 class on the legislative and regulatory process that I think I've ever seen in or out of the Clean Fuel Standard process. This is really, really useful, really, really clear on what this is. So thanks for all that overview, Elaine. Again, really want to kind of get into the weeds on the regulatory side of things, but just to kind of regurgitate everything that you just said there, the House and Senate decide at what levels they want to be reducing carbon in the transportation sector, and really don't get into too much more than that. They want to say when this thing starts, how much they want to reduce carbon in their own transportation sector over what period of time, and then they set those rules and kick off the local environmental group or agency to really figure out how to go about that. Now, the power that's given to those regulatory agencies is so immense, and so throughout their regulatory development cycle, that's really where they start touching on what their incentives are, what their priorities are, whether that's residential EV charging for low-income communities, whether that's port communities, whether it's private business, and kind of where all of that gets distributed is really up to that environmental board. Now, the super important thing to take away is a lot of times these regulatory environmental boards are very small. And so they are looking for a lot of help from stakeholders, certainly, but also other regulatory bodies that have been putting together their own regulations. So New Mexico, for example, is a relatively small environmental board that is going to be working on their own regulation, and they're in charge of kicking it off. There's a lot to do. They have to go write this crazy document. They have to stand up this crazy website to manage this whole thing, and it's probably not a super big agency in charge of all of that. And so they say, hey, California, what have you guys done? What can we use? What can we literally sometimes copy and paste out of your own regulation that we can put into ours? And so that's happening all over the place. So the kind of current state of affairs, I would say, on the regulatory side of things is really all about this amendment cycle. So Using California again as an example, they typically, over the years after they've had their regulation in place, would go back and review it every 3 years. They initially got it going in 2011 after it was passed in 2006. AB 32 was passed, and they implemented the low carbon fuel standard in California in 2011. But every few years thereafter, they go back to the regulation, assess what's working, what's not. Maybe there are other fuel types that should be encapsulated. Maybe there are certain elements that need adjusting. And so there's this very clear rinse and repeat cycle about certain things in the regulation that can be adjusted as opposed to the legislation that cannot. And so that's kind of what we're talking about here. The California LCFS specifically has gone through several iterations at this point in 2015 and 2018.
One thing I wanted to add, Todd, or maybe you could speak to a little bit more, we FuSE have a very unique perspective because we are electricity only. But I think that, we often, especially with EV adoption, still very much a nascent market and in its earliest phases. I think we often want to appreciate the work that the regulators are doing, because the hallmark of these clean fuel programs is that they are both technology and fuel agnostic. And so that is, often what gets them up, passed in the legislatures, that they've got the opportunity. It's, not specifically EV focused. And so you don't have maybe some of the initial politics going on, but as the regulators then are tasked with implementing things, there's really, they're like Todd said, a small group asked to become experts on so many different types and fuels. And so, Todd, is there anything kind of with that in your career you've seen a particular challenge or want to
Yeah,
manage?
I think that's certainly the case. I mean, the point ultimately of low carbon fuel standards is really finding a way to transition ourselves ultimately to a zero carbon future. I think if we are able to just flip a switch and make a decision today about what we would all want to be doing in the transportation side of things, I think it all is very clear. We would love to have a zero emission future, and that does not just mean a battery electric bus. That means a full life cycle zero emission future. Our ability to generate, use, and consume zero emission electricity full-fledged. And so the acknowledgement that these programs make is that is really hard. You can't just do that overnight. We all know long-haul trucking and ocean-going vessels are not going to be electrified tomorrow. And so the point is, what can we do in the meantime? That's the whole structure of this. At some juncture, our 2045, 2060, when things are much more fully electrified, that's a different dialogue. But the question about these low carbon fuel standards is what can we do between then and now? And so the task that a lot of regulatory bodies are tackling right now, to your point, Elaine, is how do we do that? And we should also mention this goes well beyond on-road electrification. I think that a lot of people think of electrification or EVs, and Connor, you could probably speak to this too, but it goes way, way beyond that, and their scope is way, way beyond that. And when as a facility operator, for example, you might be tasked with electrifying your reefer units. So you have hybridized reefer units or full battery electric containerized shipping containers or yard trucks on site or whatever. There's 1,000 different things on site that are all really on the docket for reducing that overall fuel consumption. Diesel often goes into a lot of those things. And so that's what the kind of goal of this is. And so you're asking, a regulatory agency and a staffer there to understand all of the nuance about how a yard truck works, as well as a reefer unit, as well as what's happening at port modal facilities and what the difference is between a pallet jack and a forklift. It's a lot to chew on, a lot to bite off, and they just don't really they're not experts.
Well, and this brings up an interesting point where, most of these, governing bodies, because there's so much work to be done on the electrification as a whole, there's not enough bandwidth and there's not enough resources for everyone. So, kind of to the point that you guys brought up, there's that kind of copy-paste mentality where, some of the smaller regulatory bodies, they still have a goal to meet by 2040, 2045, but they don't have the same resources as, say, California does. So they kind of ride on the coattails of some of the work that's been done in other states. Is there any kind of pitfalls, or are there like pros and cons to kind of this approach? Because, smaller states that may not have those resources can make more progress by using the resources from other states. But are there any kind of other dangers associated with that kind of work specifically for these types of clean fuel standards?
That is a great segue, actually, into kind of talking about where exactly we're at. So, yes, that's as an example, when the Oregon Clean Fuels program kicked off, the agency in that state was talking in depth with the California Air Resources Board about how to stand up their own regulation. And you saw entire swaths of the Oregon Clean Fuels program literally copied and pasted into their own regulation. Even typos and all were literally included there. Simultaneously, they use the same software development technologies to administer the program, and so you see very, very similar corollaries there. And that's a theme I think we're going to be seeing as more and more of these expand. As we look into what's going to be happening in New Mexico, are we going to be seeing much of the same language? Are we going to be seeing much of the same software on the back end? We don't know, but I would certainly expect that would be the case. And so when you're looking at updates to particular regulations or looking at people adopting their own, it absolutely can be we can ride the coattails, but you can also very much throw the baby out with the bathwater if you don't make your own appropriate adjustments for your own jurisdiction, or don't follow too closely, or worse, don't understand what the impact is of specific amendments that are required. So just kind of like getting us full circle here back to the current state. So we are looking at existing updates to the California LCFS. That has been the hot and heavy debate going on over the last several months, really over the last almost a year. With a variety of different workshops, and we can kind of get into that. But to your point, Connor, the Oregon Clean Fuels Program has opened their own regulatory amendment cycle, as has the Washington Clean Fuel Standard. But all of the timing associated with both of those updates seems very coincidental with the California LCFS. And so I think there's a lot of eyes on what the LCFS is going to be doing here in California. That's really the kind of elephant in the room, as you might say. So updates happening there, and then very recent updates have already actually just occurred in the BC market, and the Canadian CFR as well is off and running. We have our own wins and struggles, I think, with that particular program too.
Not to go on about pitfalls, because I do want this to be a very positive, positive episode, but I do think it's more, to me, Connor, a call to action for the staff at these different agencies to really take it in earnest with every rulemaking opportunity to potentially push the bounds or start to learn from the mistakes that they've individually had or the pitfalls that they've experienced firsthand, even if it's a short program tenure. Like we're seeing the Washington Clean Fuel Standard initiate its regulatory amendment cycle after only being active for 1 year. But I think I really commend the Department of Ecology for doing that, because I think these short, potentially smaller scope but more frequent iterations of these programs helps to address the newest kind of both technology, kind of on the technology front, what's available, but also just as, new staff is learning for themselves what works and what doesn't, kind of give themselves that grace to fix things, even just, small typos in the regulation. So that would be, something that I would ask the regulators to continue pushing on and to help to avoid these pitfalls in the future.
So what kind of things are actually happening in the California amendment process that's going through right now? So, California, we're going through that process at the moment. What kind of things are they actually addressing here? I know, trying to address some of the concerns that we might have had over the last few years. I know the pandemic delayed a lot of these amendments from happening, a few years ago. What are kind of the highlights? What are the most important ones that California is pushing out? Because it seems like Oregon, Washington have a high likelihood of adopting similar things.
Yeah, let me maybe set the scene of what's going on in California, because I think this is going to really bleed over to a lot of other programs, and it's also going to be setting the foundation for other programs as they come online in the next several years. So just kind of, we can start really looking at the credit price in California. Again, denominated in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. It's a unit that's been traded between low carbon fuel producers or electricity consumers and big oil. These are the Shells and Chevrons and BPs and Marathons of the world who are forced to participate in this program. And, the credit price was very, very high. It was really bouncing along the credit ceiling for quite some time in the 2018s, 19s, 2020s. And then all of a sudden, credit pricing in the California market really started to go downhill and really collapsed quite significantly, starting really 2021, July 2021, and all the way through kind of today is depressed from, say, $200 a ton down to in the mid 60s. People point to really the success of this program, frankly, about as a result. And so when more and more renewable diesel manufacturers, I should say, and importers saw that there was an opportunity to make some money in addition to the RINs that they were generating in the California market, started really kind of flooding the California market with lots of renewable diesel. And, as a result, now almost 60% of all diesel in the state of California is now renewable. However, that all happened a little bit quicker, I think, than the California Air Resources Board expected. And so you have lots of new renewable fuels generating credits in the state. Similarly, you have lots of renewable natural gas projects online. And so there's just kind of been a dearth of credits originating that's thrown the supply and demand mechanic a little out of whack. And so the ARB looked at that and said, oh man, we need to start making some adjustments. So they noticed this several years ago at this point, that these credit prices were starting to go downhill, and that it was going downhill fast enough that it was causing concern, and that the actual program itself might not be able to self-adjust. And so they started this regulatory amendment cycle. Now, we are an EV-focused podcast, and so you think about that up against the idea that the ARB and all these other regulatory bodies ultimately, at some juncture, want a zero-emission future full of battery electric or hydrogen technologies. And so we look at what is happening in the EV provisions. Now, the regulatory amendment cycle in California is very focused on what's going on with renewable diesel. What do feedstocks look like? Should we be doing avoided methane crediting and all of these other things that surely will have a meaningful impact on the LCFS credit price. But our goal is to look at what is specifically happening in the EV provisions, which are very quickly growing relative to those other fuels, because the vast majority of credit origination and really ultimately the vast majority of all fuel being used in the state is going to be electricity down the road. And that's what we're focused on. And I think that every hour that we spend on efforts to adjust the EV regulations themselves is going to be worth 1,000 in the future because of the influence we're having at the early days. And so on the EV side of things, quite a few updates up for discussion right now. A lot of comments on what's going on in the EV space. We're kind of in a tough position, honestly, with a lot of the regulatory bodies, because so many of the arguments, so much of the attention is given to those liquid and gaseous fuels, like I was saying, and so little given to the EV provisions. And so a lot of the complaints are right now kind of going not unheard, but they're hard to really get the right attention on. But that said, some good progress in California right now, and maybe Elaine, maybe there's 2 or 3 topic areas that we can kind of peel the onion on in the California market.
Yeah, well, I think too, one thing I'll add is that it was interesting watching the workshop that just happened 2 days ago on Wednesday, April 10th, the big CARB LCFS amendment workshop, where staff really acknowledged in their presentation material just what their expectations are for the growing proportion of EV-derived credits are going to make up the future credit bank. So, the relative share of renewable diesel based credits, any kind of, other liquid or gaseous fuels is going to decrease along kind of commensurate with the other state mandates to transition to zero emission vehicle fleets. And so at least in my opinion, or an observation from that is, I feel, to Todd's point, that a lot of the attention has not been adequately given yet far to the electricity provision of the regulation, but it's almost as if, it's kind of that we'll save it for later, we'll get to that later part, but I think we, do that at kind of discounting the potential success later on, because the devil is in the details, which you'll hear us say over and over. Specifically, what are those details? And to your point, Todd, the layers of the onion, we might say the FCI, medium and heavy duty opportunities that are now becoming available, the reduction in crediting to certain off-road equipment types like forklifts, which have been a very large driver of electricity credits up to this point. The opportunity for multi-residential EV charging to, instead of defaulting credit generation to utilities, to actually go back into the hands directly of the folks that are investing in the EVSEs or electric vehicle supply equipment, EV chargers themselves. And I'd say a big part of it that we'll probably need to spend some time talking about would be third-party verification, which is pretty novel for the electricity space. And we, those are the probably the 4 or 5 details and devils that we would want to talk about.
Infrastructure crediting, for those that haven't heard of this, is an area special provision of the LCFS program where entities that are installing or owning DC fast charging stations that are openly available to the public can earn essentially some extra credits, and it's relative to the size of the unit in lieu of the rest of the program, which is very much tied to how much energy you are dispensing. And so this is really meant to solve this kind of chicken and egg situation with DC fast charging infrastructure. Honestly, it's why you see so many Tesla DC fast chargers out at your local Target. If it's probably why you might see some very expensive DC fast charging systems at your local gas station. They're all able to leverage the FCI infrastructure crediting of the LCFS program to help get those in the ground and help recoup some of those costs without being concerned that they might not be used. And so that's a really, really powerful part of the program. Again, another many millions, hundreds of millions probably have been generated for entities installing those units specifically to get them deployed. And so a couple of adjustments coming to that program upcoming, which are really important. One is that they are going to be limiting really where a lot of those DC fast charging systems can be installed. And so not super clear as to why they would stop so much momentum on the FCI program for light duty vehicles, honestly, considering it's really going pretty well and it hasn't hit any sort of caps or limitations within the program by any means. But they are going to be limiting where they can be deployed to specific disadvantaged communities and certain distance restrictions from other units being installed and whatnot. So that's a little unfortunate, but what is great is that they are also proposing a new medium and heavy duty infrastructure crediting piece. And so that's a really good new opportunity. It's going to work very much like the original light duty one. The original program is, again, very specific to light duty, but is targeting at heavy duty.
Can I actually ask a question? You mentioned that this is actually not going to be beneficial in the long term by being able to kind of limit the areas that you can kind of install these chargers. Why do you think that? Is there specific limitations that are going to prevent widespread adoption, or are they trying to focus it on specific areas? Why is it so potentially detrimental?
I think the fear that the agency has is that any one particular business might go in and install 7,000 DC fast chargers in the middle of Kettleman City or something and do it for the sole purposes of doing infrastructure crediting. And so the agency put some limitations on the size of these specific sites to limit how many can be at any one given site. And that's especially true on the medium and heavy duty side of things. The problem is that the limits they incurred are actually quite low. And so there are functional business models out there that are trying to address something like drayage, for example, that will have a certain amount of needed DC fast chargers on site to really service their own customers, but extend the bounds of this infrastructure crediting. And so, they I think just kind of over limited the specific deployments, if you agree with that, Elaine.
Yeah, and I think a point that was brought up several times by a few of the California utility companies, Southern California Edison, I think potentially PG&E as well, representatives during the workshop, made the point that CARB potentially shouldn't be funneling or diverting fast chargers away from areas where there's already grid capacity and infrastructure, electrical capacity available to install these. And so, in terms of just getting as much infrastructure out there to keep pace and encourage public adoption of EVs, it kind of makes sense to start where we have the most resources readily available. It's also much more cost effective to do things that way. And I would also say another point brought up by some of our environmental justice groups is, yet again, this may indirectly divert traffic patterns to already impacted communities that have dealt with transportation overload and kind of those busier corridors, because there's, this now certain requirements to build in certain areas, and then, of course, limit how many can be placed. So that would be one other potential.
And it's geographically constrained, if I remember correctly, as well, where you can only put chargers within a certain distance of an existing DC fast charger as well. So, you could put them into certain areas, but there's kind of a circle around existing infrastructure that you either have to install or you're not allowed to install.
They have specific requirements about how far you might be from an existing one, as well as ensuring that this is for light duty, as well as you are ensuring you are in a disadvantaged SB 535 disadvantaged community. And so without those qualifications, and we can double check what else the specific requirements are, but yes, there are now restrictions, whereas before you could have put them anywhere you like on the light duty side. Now, again, great to see the new heavy duty program, but again, I think that the takeaway is if there is need and interest in business models that can functionally leverage and need something like the FCI program or a heavy duty infrastructure accrediting program to see a Port of Long Beach drayage project successful, then we shouldn't get in its way.
Can I actually ask Connor a question too? One thing that, in this medium and heavy duty FCI crediting requirements, I know that the capacity of the DC fast charger has to be 180 kilowatts. I think that's the minimum. How prevalent these days is a station of that size? I know some of our larger partners install 150 kilowatts, and they're fairly sophisticated. So that 180 threshold, is that going to be hard for people to meet?
It's an interesting point of inflection right now where some fleets are starting to think about having, higher powered chargers, and some aren't. So we're in this kind of unique circumstance where having additional power at a specific site is beneficial in some respects for future proofing, but many vehicles that they're considering today can't take advantage as much of those kind of higher power ratings than others, because, and this is kind of going back to kind of the public comment periods that we've seen in this amendment, is that the number of conversations that the fleets have kind of brought up is that they're trying to electrify the low-hanging fruit right now. Mm-hmm. And in many cases, Class 6 and Class 8 vehicles are running 50, 80, 100 miles a day, and they haven't been electrified yet. And some fleets can dwell for 6, 8, 10 hours. So, you don't need that huge kind of power rating for a lot of vehicles that could be electrified over the next 5, 6 years. So understanding that, yes, you do have to future-proof over the next 10, 15, 20 years. That's absolutely something that fleets need to do. But there's many, many fleets that could take advantage of, 100 kilowatts charging, 120 kilowatt charging, having dedicated infrastructure that would have a huge reduction in CO2, but not having, the need for 180 kilowatts, because many vehicles right now can't accept 180 kilowatts of charging. Right. 250 kilowatts of charging is very difficult. Some can only max out at 150. So, having additional power for many depots and many facilities isn't required, and in some cases will not be required in the future. Mm-hmm. There's some routes that just will never need that type of charging, but they're not going to be able to take advantage of, some of that infrastructure crediting because they don't meet the requirements for these much higher power charging, where FCI, it was at 50 kilowatts. Now it's tripling. So there's, those kinds of things where, from my experience in these kind of public comments and these public meetings, that never really got discussed in a huge way. It was something that might have been mentioned once or twice, but it was really the vast majority of the conversations wasn't on what is the low-hanging fruit. It's more talking about what are we going to need in 2040, 2045.
I think what you're saying there, Connor, is that regulators really have an eye to the future, and that sometimes, there's incentives that are a little mismatched with what just current reality is. But I think that goes back to the idea that if we have more frequent regulatory amendment cycles, we can actually keep things at a more a better pace with each other, so that technology and active deployments match the intent of the regulation and the kind of mechanics of it, so that maybe we don't look to future proof a regulation or the requirements so many years into the future, and end up over having surplus to requirements in the reg.
Well, and this is actually interesting and kind of curious to see what you guys think, what that kind of cadence could be, because, this most recent amendment, from, kind of an outsider looking in, it looks like it was delayed quite a lot. We were trying to get it done by, the beginning of this year. It looks like it's going to be potentially by the end of this year, early next year. It was just delayed quite a lot, but they were aiming for like a 2-year cadence. Do you think that 2 years is enough time to kind of get a good sense of what these changes did, come up with a good solution to some of the problems that have been identified, and then implement those solutions?
Yeah, I'll take a swing at that. So the California program specifically had been following a semi 3-year cadence since its inception. So I think the plan originally for this particular one was to also follow that 3-year cadence. The California scoping plan follows a 3-year cadence, but I think COVID really did get in the way of this particular amendment cycle. There just literally wasn't a functional place to visit, right in the middle of all of this. And so that was a little bit troublesome. However, these programs have become much more complex. Again, these are very, very big programs, all different manner of fuels, on-road, off-road. There's all sorts of SAF or sustainable aviation fuel discussions going on right now, all really landing on the plate of a lot of the same regulatory staffers and management for the programs as before. And so, as we look at what that cadence is and really get, more and more detailed, the need for more frequent review, or better, more specific expertise on hand to be able to look at these particular regulations has got to be thought about.
Yeah, I was thinking about that during the 9 hours of the workshop the other day, and just thinking that if you've been there for for all that time, and you want to make your 3-minute comment, you could be in very good company if whatever the scope of the rulemaking is and the specific interests that day of staff happens to be. But I think, I felt for us at FuSE, we're in fairly limited company. I mean, just our priorities are markedly different. And it would be, as we move forward with these programs and they become more sophisticated in their outreach to stakeholders, I think getting really intentional and focused on each of the specific fuels. As much as the program is agnostic, I think they have to bring in subject matter experts, to your point, Todd, and not put it on regulators' shoulders to know everything about what's going on, because I think it just crowds things too much, and it kind of leaves people a little frustrated when they don't feel like their priorities are heard.
Yeah, and this may be a topic for another day, but I think, these regulatory agencies themselves, almost as a result, might also scare off some of their best talent. I mean, we've seen senior leadership leave some of these regulatory bodies in fashion all over the place. And so kind of an interesting dynamic to peel apart, I think, at some point down the road, is how to incentivize and keep, the folks that really know what's going on there aboard, and not pulled off to some consultancy somewhere to help make sure that they can push these programs forward and do so eloquently. All right, so just kind of coming back to our little short list of California things here. So, FCI infrastructure crediting, there's a lot of stuff on this. There's a lot of good commentary that went into the ARB about infrastructure crediting. Happy to post some content, some links to good comment articles, some good how-tos or 101s on infrastructure crediting and why this thing is going to be important to your average Joe down the road here relatively soon. But next, I think it might make sense to actually talk about third-party verification, since this also spans up into the Canadian markets a bit. So just for some added context, third-party verification, what that is a system that really double checks that the data that is being submitted to state agencies is legit. The purpose of it when it was first implemented is when you have something like, say, your local ethanol plant. And the ethanol plant has lots of widgets and knobs and levers and all sorts of things that might actually influence the actual carbon intensity of that fuel being developed. You might not maybe use more electricity than you thought at a different time, or maybe you trucked it a little bit differently. The point is to have a third-party verifier. These are usually complex and pretty expensive engineering firms. Come like double check your work, and if it all looks legit, they give you a rubber stamp and you submit your data and you get your credits and you move forward.
And Todd, if I could there, we kind of this is yet another way that electricity is specifically different. Could you go into kind of what makes our priorities as a group that represents these electricity providers, kind of that end use fuel switching, so different on a scale size compared to the renewable diesel conglomerates that we see?
Yeah. So this kind of goes into credit ownership and such, and then I'll get back into third-party verification. But yeah, the way the mechanics of how these programs work and why they're so powerful is that the agency, CARB in this example here, they set the rules on who gets the credits. They say who gets the money, and they do that by saying, well, we want to incentivize somebody along that decision-making chain to make the right choice about what kind of fuel to make, and so or what kind of fuel to buy, I should say. And that might be electricity, that might be renewable diesel, that might be fossil diesel, that might be who knows what. And so they've defined very specifically about who gets the money. And on the renewable fuel side of things, say if you are a renewable diesel purchase or a renewable diesel manufacturer, you are the entity eligible to get credits. And the point of that is saying, hey, if we let a renewable diesel manufacturer, maybe a company that runs around and collects used vegetable oil from restaurants and turns it into diesel, if they are able to earn credits, they can actually reduce their operating costs and they can sell diesel for less. And therefore, maybe somebody that's buying, diesel or for their local delivery company might choose that renewable option instead of the diesel option because it's the same cost, and why not? And so they make similar decisions for all types of fuels. Now, on the electricity side, that is much different. So on the entities really producing electricity as a fuel, that's what you would think it is. It's your local utility. And so the utility is producing fuel, but the agency didn't really see a lot of incentive for just giving more money to local utilities because it doesn't necessarily imply that Bob down the road is going to choose a battery electric box truck instead of a diesel box truck. And so they decided to give credit ownership to people consuming that fuel. And so the consumers of electricity are the ones that can earn credits in this case. So that makes a lot of sense. Now, if you tell Bob, hey, if you buy a battery electric box truck, you're going to earn money for using your fuel instead of using a fossil fuel where you'd earn no money and it's actually more expensive anyway, that's pretty incentivizing for Bob to do that, right? And so that's a huge difference of electricity generators relative to new ones. And then you think about, just to kind of your point, Elaine, the size of these entities are much different. So you're a renewable diesel manufacturer or your ethanol plant. These are enormous institutions. They are very, very big companies, and there are not very many of them. But you think about Bob, there's a lot of Bobs, and there's a lot of companies out there that are looking and consuming electricity as a fuel. And so it's a whole different kind of can of worms to ask Bob to look at his data verification. And that's kind of getting into third-party verification and electricity here a little bit. So.
No, and I think too, talking now that we've set the scene a bit of what third-party verification is, maybe at the kind of liquid and gaseous fuel side at the production plant, getting into what makes that so different and so important to really get right the first time as California is considering implementing this verification requirement for the electricity folks. It's just the size of the end credit generator compared to the cost of these verification services. So, you know, like we mentioned, this is unheard of in any US program. There, you know, Washington, Oregon, they don't have these verification requirements yet for electricity, but our friends up north do in the Canadian, the clean fuels regulation. And so we at FuSE have just gone through that process on behalf of our electricity credit generators for the first time. And we were really blown away when we went through the list of accredited verifiers and how just expensive it really is for
and limited.
and
There aren't very
there
many.
not a lot of competition. Certainly, you know, with the speed between when folks actually got accredited and could get their company, their verification company name on the site as a potential option, to when, you know, these services need to actually be deployed, there's very little information if you go to one of these verifiers websites about what it actually looks like to provide verification for EV specific credit generating activities. So we found, you know, ultimately that any you know, the Bobs of the world are just not going to participate in these in clean fuel programs on an individual basis. And so we, you know, probably have, I don't know if we've actually spoken about the role of aggregators. That's a whole other can of worms, but really essentially talking about the need then to either instate a credit generation minimum, which is what we are seeing proposed in the current California amendment cycle. 6,000 credits, I believe, is the threshold. But, you know, if you're under that, you do not necessarily need to get your electricity reporting verified. But, you know, anything over that, you would. But I think, you know, making that as equitable as possible so that Bob on his own is not paying northwards of $10,000, which is, you know, not presenting any near-term or reasonable ROI for participating in these programs in the first place, that he's not really burdened with a really otherwise unfair practice, or you know, relative little risk to the program overall, right? If for some reason there was a discrepancy in his report. So we have to protect the Bobs.
Yeah, exactly. So I think this also speaks to a couple of things, but just to clarify too, for anyone listening to, the ARB is considering third-party verification, or they will be implementing third-party verification for the all electricity transactions, all electricity submissions in the whole new program now. So that's kind of what's on the table in the influence that we're chatting about here now as well. Now, in the current program, I should also mention that there is also a minimum threshold for credit generation for existing credit generators that are subject to third-party verification. So if you're a renewable diesel manufacturer or a landfill gas plant, if you aren't producing 6,000 credits, you do have special exemptions applied. So, but the catch is, I think that thinking or that threshold is just mentally just not being considered on the EV side of things about the influence and the size constraints that a lot of the electricity generators have. It's kind of one of these copy and paste situations where it's just EVs getting lumped in with everything else for some particular reason, despite having been exempted before for these exact reasons. And so pretty tough thing to navigate. Still a lot of lack of clarity. There's still a lot of lack of clarity on how that is going to be applied, what is the role of an aggregator. To your point, Elaine, 90+% of all electricity transactions today are done through some sort of aggregator, through some sort of representative similar to FuSE. And so if that doesn't apply to the aggregation level, that's going to exclude large portions of the overall electricity credit generation pool.
Yeah, Connor, so I think another big differentiator for the EV space compared to, our liquid and gaseous fuel friends would be the reliability of the electricity data that's available. Obviously you work with a number of leading charging network operators who have these wonderful cloud-based platforms, and their hardware is verified within a plus or minus very small margin for accuracy standards. Could you talk a little bit about what you think from that perspective of, is the hardware capable, is the software capable, and comparing that to this other additional verification practices? What do you think about that?
Well, the short answer is yes. The equipment that is out there is capable of, monitoring energy consumption data accurately and reliably within, in my opinion, kind of a reasonable, threshold. The question really is that CARB doesn't have a lot of kind of guidance on what that verification process is going to be like. What are they actually verifying? Are they going to?
What are they verifying? That's such a good question. What are we verifying here?
That's the thing, is that what are we actually going to be verifying? Is there a specific reference on, the accuracy? Are we going to require revenue grade metering, which is, a definition that, many companies would need to meet? This is a conversation that, I think at the moment, from what I was seeing from these kind of regulatory bodies, the third-party verification proposals are premature because they're saying that, we need to have third-party verification, but not telling us what that entails. Like, what are we going to be verifying at the level 2 charger level? Are we monitoring, DC fast chargers differently because they're used differently? There's not a lot of guidance there on, what happens if something isn't verified to be accurate enough and what steps can be taken to actually bring it back into compliance. There's a lot of these different questions that really haven't been answered, at least at the moment, from the, public comment periods and the proposals that we've seen from the California Air Resources Board. But from my perspective, if there is a verification process that requires significant involvement with the fleets, that's going to be detrimental to anyone trying to get involved. Because, the regulations here are for direct investment into EV infrastructure for anyone, small mom and pops all the way up to Fortune 50. So, these programs are meant for everyone in the state who is looking to electrify and help them. But if there's going to be, undue verification involvement by these companies that say, they have to entertain site visits to, a number of their different sites, and they're going to have to provide this data, and we're going to have to interact with them. That's a huge amount of administrative burden, and it's unclear what that benefit is going to be on. What are we verifying? What are we trying to prevent at the moment? And hopefully this is going to change in, kind of future iterations of the amendment. But at the moment, it doesn't seem like the kind of the value proposition really is there for the average company looking to enroll in the program.
I'd say too, what we've experienced already in doing our due diligence with accredited verifiers, we literally were told at one point that, the verification process is basically a coffee chat where, a verifier would roll up in their rented Chevy Bolt and do a charging session and essentially tick a box. Now, I think that's achievable and, easily replicated when you're dealing with light duty vehicles. But how do you fundamentally apply that when you were talking about electric reefer units, when we're talking about giant rubber tiered gantry cranes? I think that it's going to be really challenging, the level of technical ability for the verifiers, who are accredited in Canada, but most of the time actually US based companies. And it's, very reasonable to assert that they would be the same groups providing verification services for these US programs. How are they, for them to meet the immediate need of the verification requirements for all of these diverse off-road fleets, I think is just not going to be attainable. When we've kind of presented some of these concerns, even in really early kind of listening sessions to regulators in Oregon and Washington, I think, it's a little bit of passing the hat from the staff, where they say, well, the subject matter experts are going to be the verifiers and we'll make them the subject matter experts. But I think overall, that really has not been fleshed out in any program yet. And so to your point, Connor, it's like, what does that actually look like? Because, just will it actually be workable or not?
Yeah, I mean, you think about the equitable component of this is just hard to miss. I mean, 95+% of trucking companies own less than 10 trucks. 99% have less than 100 trucks. And so, when we're looking at these companies that ultimately are going to be the hardest to decarbonize, and you're asking them to do something that just doesn't really mechanically make a lot of sense, and asking a third party to come in who is not incentivized to save any costs for you is, it's kind of it's a little backwards. And so the other thing I just kind of want to mention is that the mechanical difference between liquid and gaseous fuels and electricity is something that doesn't seem to come up in this dialogue. I think PG&E actually had a really great comment letter on this to the ARB that of course went unanswered, but you think of an ethanol production facility, and there's a lot of different things happening physically on site. There's a lot of different components. There's a lot of different adjustable mechanisms. There's different trucking routes where it could go. Maybe someone decides they want to train it instead, or put it on rail instead of truck it somewhere. All of this stuff that ultimately does and probably should get third party verified. That does make sense if we're trying to be honest about life cycle emissions. Then making sure that these very variable and mechanical things are working correctly and are in line with what is being reported totally makes sense. But if you are looking at a DC fast charger at your local Target, the fuel supply of that process is completely out of hand. You're talking about a listed piece of equipment, usually a DC fast charging system that is UL certified and better, has certain quality standards, pushing data to an enterprise level cloud-based platform. Very, very little opportunity for someone to kind of get in the way and fiddle with what energy consumption looks like.
Let alone I'll just mention on the light duty vehicle side, when these things are producing revenue for the site host, the additional kind of requirements that be accurate, because your customers would be very angry if you were charging them for, the wrong amount of electricity when you're doing a cents per kilowatt hour business model in the first place. It's easy, but I think that's where it's the verification and the kind of is easiest on the light duty side, but really just woefully unaddressed in the details for how it would be implemented for off-road.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, and looking at how this is implemented, kind of going back to, the fact that California is not the only program in North America, that if there's a precedent set by California, that copy-paste mentality that we were talking about is going to kind of, hopefully not, but it may rear its ugly head and start, seeing this perpetuate itself into some of the other programs, as well as, the Canadian programs. Do you think that this would set a precedent, whatever is being done with not only this amendment cycle, but in California in general related to EVs? Is this setting a precedent for the other regulatory bodies to just really not take a hard look at these things and rectify it themselves? What do you guys think of, the dangers of really, going through with these things without considering the EVs as significant enough in California's regulatory process to, bear this much scrutiny?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just mention that third-party verification for the electricity provision is already within the scope of the amendment cycles in Oregon and Washington, and they obviously took their cues from California. That's pretty apparent.
Yeah, I mean, spillover is the biggest concern here. I mean, California Carbon, or C Carbon, is a little spin out of C Kinetics, big kind of consultancy in this space. They say 2/3 of North America is going to be covered by a clean fuels standard of some fashion in the next 10 years. And so if that's the case, there are regulatory bodies, environmental bodies that have 8 people in their department, and they look at the California Air Resources Board and see that they have 1,300 people or whatever it is, and say no way that we can be as sophisticated and develop our own rules, and therefore I'm just going to control F my regulatory cycle and copy paste everything. And so that's the biggest concern we have. It's less a concern about what happens in California, although that's obviously one of the biggest, most liquid markets out here for which we work. But I'm very concerned if New York finally passes a particular rule, or anyone else, that they need to ensure that they're having the amount of clarity that they need around these issues.
Yeah, and maybe just to sum this up and give an ask to CARB and DEQ and Ecology and any other agency that's administering a similar program, you know, we totally acknowledge obviously the fraudulent cases that have negatively impacted these programs. We obviously all know about what happened in Oregon, where there were DC fast chargers left in their packaging, and someone was fraudulently collecting credits for these unopened charging stations. But I think the real question to grapple with is that don't pass the hat to verifiers for what should really be an enforcement issue at the end of the day. There are always, because I think what we're finding is that the verifiers available are not equipped yet to deal with the level of nuance that the bad actors that may exist in these spaces, or for these kind of lesser known equipment types are still, it's not going to take the problem away that someone does something that's dishonest. And so I think what you end up doing by making verification the default is really limit opportunities for small businesses to participate, and to participate on their own if they want to. So I think that's at the heart of it, it's an equity issue.
It's a total equity issue. I mean, the groups that are approved as third-party verifiers now, they're fantastic. They're very sophisticated engineering firms that have the right people on staff to do complex engineering analysis and review of specific requirements that are going to be very relevant to Tier 2 pathways. Those are the same groups that are going to be doing EV provisions. They're those same groups that are supposed to as simply just look and ensure that your charge point data sessions are showing up on your dashboard are actually there. But they're going to end up charging at the same rate. They have the ability to do that because they have a corner on this verification market. And all of a sudden, that's way too expensive, way too time consuming, way too complicated for anyone to participate. And it's been one of the largest equitable concerns, I think, of the particular program across the board, especially if third-party verification is not going to be subject or is going to be subject to everybody, not just an aggregated entity.
Kind of changing gears potentially on some of the other major updates from California and some really positive changes that from our perspective at least. Todd or Connor, would you want to talk a little bit and let our listeners know about what's so meaningful with this, the changing of default credit generation from the utility in the case of multi-residential EV charging back to those site hosts?
Yeah, Connor, go for that.
I take a very, end user focused kind of approach to these things, because whoever is paying for the equipment should be the ones who, receive the revenue. And I've always seen the utilities make, an important part of this entire process. And they should be involved in the program at some point, but the default should always be whoever pays, operates, and, maintains those chargers. So the fact that we're now changing the default credit generator to the companies, the entities, the people in many cases who are operating the chargers, say for multifamily unit dwellings, that's really, really beneficial. Because I've had a lot of conversations, just anecdotally, with companies and real estate developers or property owners that really want to install chargers, but they don't have the means to do it. Or when they call us up and say, hey, what's this low carbon fuel standard? Is there a way for us to get ongoing, revenue for this? They go, oh, I may actually be able to offer free charging for everyone at my building. And it's lowering the cost of ownership to the point where a lot of them are now seriously considering this. So changing that default credit generation, not just for, the multifamily unit dwellings, but also for the ETRU regulations, where the owner of the charger is the one who's going to get the credits as well, is just as beneficial. And for the same reasons, the owner of the equipment, who's maintaining the equipment, who's paying for the electricity, is now getting the credits. To me, that's the most beneficial thing that you could do.
I'll just add to the discussion about multifamily residential and bringing that back to just overall, the fact is that most folks are going to be doing charging at home if they have the opportunity to. And I think, we see, single family residences, and you've got all the bells and whistles and your Tesla charger that's available to you all the time whenever you're parked at home. But the ability to bring that opportunity for EV charging to dwelling places for folks that don't own their residence is really, really huge. I mean, and I just think that if you're a property developer, and you're making the decision about how many station or EV chargers are you going to put in your big parking garage, there's just nothing, from that business perspective, there's nothing that's quite as motivating as having proceeds directly deposited to you, where you have a lot of flexibility with how they're used. And so you can earmark funds to go to this charging infrastructure that's being used by people that are often underrepresented in EV ownership overall.
100%. I mean, the way that works right now ahead of this amendment is that the agency essentially estimates how many residential chargers there are in any particular utility territory and just gives those credits to the local utility. For context, they gave almost 1,850,000 or 880,000 credits to local utilities just last quarter. That's something like almost $60 million. Every 90 days going to your local utilities across the state. And the idea is that they use those funds to help with offering their own incentives, maybe making level 2 chargers a little bit cheaper on their website if you buy that, or maybe have a special EV rate. But you're really trusting that your local utility is really actually passing a lot of those costs through in a beneficial way. And, I think of some of the bigger utilities in the state. I don't know if that's really what's going on. And so the ability for us to kind of short circuit that now to the owners in multifamily residences is unbelievably helpful and really is a very good equitable decision, kind of to your point, Elaine. These are people that might not own their own house. And if you think about homeowners who are installing their own level 2 chargers at the single family residences, do they need it? Probably not. Do they need it? But do owners of multifamily residences and owners of those kinds of charging systems where they might not own single family residences, that's a great place to be tucking some money to help advance the state of affairs there.
So that's definitely a very exciting side of the changes that we're seeing specifically to California, but we'll see how things get rolled out. I would not be surprised if in the initial draft language that gets released from DEQ or Ecology, we see many of these changes mirrored directly as they relate to the electricity sides of the program.
Yeah.
And beyond that, I think we've covered a lot of the major changes, except for one of our beachhead markets, and something that's near and dear to all of our hearts at FuSE. Some of the changes that are going on in the material handling space, which has been contentious for a number of years for a number of reasons. But Todd, in the 5 years that you've been just living and breathing the LCFS with similar
been
programs.
That long already, huh? Yeah. Half a decade? Yeah, thanks.
Yes, and knowing what we know about how many or what our partner fleets are comprised of, and kind of the interesting projects and opportunities that they've had unlocked specifically by leveraging the revenue generated by electric forklifts. Can you talk a little bit about what regulators may be missing in the conversation about cutting credits to forklifts?
Yeah, and honestly, this discussion is less about forklifts as it is about the methods that they're applying in this particular use case that might bleed over to other equipment types down the road. But again, kind of this is another very important sort of equitable discussion here, because we're talking about trying to decarbonize often industrial facilities or commercial facilities that aren't very, very big. These are your local distribution centers or local cold storage facilities or local port tenants or whatever that are operating industrial material handling equipment on site. And if they're able to, and they have been able to participate since 2015 really, but 2017 in some meaningful fashion, they're able to earn some revenue by using battery electric material handling equipment on site. That's a revenue stream that they didn't have before, that they can sink into either more of that type of technology in lieu of, say, propane or diesel, usually propane, or able to buy level 2 chargers for their staff, or buy zero emission light duty vehicles for their operations, or buy infrastructure for their reefer units or some other thing. And so it's been a really meaningful and impactful part of the program for a long time, largely because this is a technology type that's been widely deployed for a while. And so it's been a very good method to be able to help fund these local businesses, often many, many small and medium-sized businesses, hundreds, thousands, really, actually, of participants in these programs in California, even specifically, to generate quite a bit of money for that buy down of operations, for that decarbonization of their own operations, has all come through often the material handling space. The overall credit generation pool, even just in the last, of the LCFS program, it's 15 to 20% of overall credit generations has been from material handling for that reason.
And I think too, when many of our fleet partners, their first foray into electrification and kind of cleaning up their operations really is through these electric forklifts. And, in terms of the market penetration of these and whether they are the baseline anymore for that fuel is it really predominantly propane or diesel? I think that should be somewhat less of a question of rather than what do these fleets end up using the proceeds that they get from credits for. And I think we've seen really great case studies. Folks all of a sudden have some revenue or some kind of pocket change that they can put towards those L2 chargers, but maybe it stacks it on itself over time, and they feel ready to go procure a much more expensive and potentially riskier equipment type, like an electric box truck, and they're getting and then that gets enrolled into one of these programs, and it's really compounding. But I think I have a hard time thinking that it won't put a bad taste in the mouth of these fleets that are being essentially forced out of participating, maybe very prematurely, by the reduction in credit generation from forklifts. And Todd, maybe you could talk a little bit more about what the mechanisms are that are affecting forklifts.
Yeah, totally. So, I think this has become quite of a political issue inside of the ARB. Again, there's been so much downward sell pressure because there's so many credits in the system because of increased renewable diesel primarily, but certainly because of increased crediting from low volumes, actually, of ultra low carbon renewable natural gases, quite a bit of residential crediting. You start adding all this stuff up, and people start saying, well, this thing is oversupplied and we need to reduce the credit pool. And one of the things I think that has been really finger pointed at, in largely because there's very little representation of small and medium-sized businesses in this program, is forklifts. There's not a lot of cold storage facility managers showing up to the ARB workshops and voicing complaint. And so, it's been an easy target in a lot of ways. And so the forklift industry is going to be impacted quite heavily on this. The biggest reason why is kind of this runaround on a calculation within the system that is being adjusted relative to what is called an EER score. It's the energy economy ratio. We don't need to get too crazy about it right now, but it's really the amount of energy it takes for an EV to do the same amount of work relative to a fossil fuel counterpart. And so there's a score in this program. That's really what it represents. And the ARB is essentially asserting that score should be much lower, about 1/2 of what it was going to be originally for forklifts. And they're doing so by saying the population density is increased and therefore the turnover baseline is changed, and some other stuff that doesn't actually come into play within the calculus of this program and how credit calculations work, but they've done it anyway, and their only mechanism for making this adjustment is via this EER score modification. And so really kind of in our opinion, an unfair adjustment, one that doesn't really come into the calculus or isn't supposed to come into the calculus for credit origination in these particular programs, and is unfortunately going to really harm a lot of small and medium-sized businesses and their opportunity to continue participating.
And one thing I'll mention too is, specific to Oregon, we know that they have the legislative mandate that every credit represents a true reduction, or true reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And I think when we get further and further away in this energy economy ratio, from the engineering scientific basis for what it means and how it was initially calculated, we do damage to the efficacy of the program. And, it's something that we like to fall back on in our clients, especially, folks that are maybe not initially environmentally minded, or they've got their priorities elsewhere, but we can really show like, hey, every credit that you're generating is backed by this very scientific basis, the life cycle analysis. I mean, that's really the kind of environmental science background, and giving that as a basis of trust to all of the participants. It really erodes the trust when the agencies or staff start meddling with these things just to produce a credit reduction or a revenue decrease, whatever it might be, or to meet political
right
ends.
And one of the most important people in that trust equation are investors. And so people making long-term investments in these types of technologies and these types of decarbonization projects, if they look at these programs and say, wow, this looks great for 3 years, but in 3 years who knows what happens, because the ER score might change because of population changing or turnover ratios changing, I'm probably going to hedge my bets a little bit about making some long-term investments, often in technology types that have 10-year lifetimes. And so, trust is a big one, absolutely big one on the social standpoint, on the equity standpoint, on the investment standpoint, and just kind of maybe bringing this full circle and bringing this all the way home here. To your point, Elaine, not having to really kind of mess with these types of parts of the program, I think is something that is so overlooked here. The ARB, ultimately, I think we all agree that having a fully decarbonized future is the way to go about it. And, I think we all see that we will at some day get there, and that the point of these LCFS programs is to get us there. But they have two tools at their disposal. One is, kind of trying to rein in extra crediting and extra provisions of the program that they think might have, oversupply or whatever, kind of contributing to downward credit price. But they also can just adjust the compliance curves. They can really do this at their own disposal to do nothing else but make this, tighten the screws on big oil here to pay the difference. And so the ability to, do that, I think, should be the biggest priority. Like, why do anything else? It's all working really, really well, as we've seen. So just make it tighter, tougher, and we'll get to where we're going faster without having to roll back the opportunities for a lot of, companies and in places that could benefit in the near term.
Well, and Todd, you would see a lot of support for that same stance on, of all places, LCFS Twitter, which I did not know was a thing until yesterday, when one of our coworkers mentioned that there, one day we'd love to have maybe some of those voices come on the charge cycle and talk about why they're so passionate about not triggering the auto acceleration mechanism at certain reduction points.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. Well, a lot happening on the regulatory front. I feel like we only just really scratched the surface there. We could talk about this stuff for another few hours if we had to. Didn't get too deep in the weeds on the Canadian CFR or ECCC or the work that Emily is doing up in BC. But we do post a lot of this stuff. We talk about it quite regularly. If anyone's interested in learning a little bit more about these processes, please reach out. Let us follow along. Other than that, Connor, Elaine, any last words before we sign off here?
I would just like to say that, as I started this out explaining, I didn't come from a background that was very privy to the world of, regulatory amendment cycles and comment letters. And it is really intimidating. I think even navigating these agency websites is super confusing. It feels off, I think, more than it should, that you have to be an insider to know what's going on, and that if you're not showing up in person to one of these workshops in your full suit, that your voice won't be heard. And that's ultimately what I think in order for these programs to work and be successful, getting as many eyes on them, getting stakeholders involved early in the process and frequently. And that's something that I'm going to challenge myself, my team to do, our partner success, is to really empower our partners to step up and share their concerns. And it doesn't have to be super technical, with regulators in whatever format they feel most comfortable with. And, I'll just affirm FuSE's commitment, of course, to help make that possible. So along with resources we might share on our website, you're always welcome to reach out specifically to any of us to talk more about these things and how to get involved in the future.
And I have to say, I'm just glad that I can pass my, high school government exam now. So, my high school government class, I would have gotten a much better grade if I talked to you guys before. But it seems like this entire process, kind of hearing what your guys' opinions are of the entire kind of legislative process, but also, the regulatory process, which I wasn't as familiar with, the amendment cycles and the amount of work and effort that's going into them, and the ability to make, changes that seem to be, either, beneficial or detrimental to the program. It's really important just to continue to engage in these public comment periods, in any type of activity with the governing agency, because we do have an opportunity to make them better. And that's the most exciting part for me. So hopefully we just continue doing it. Hopefully we're going to see a lot of changes over the next few years. And, if credit prices do go back up, then I'm thinking we're going to see a lot more electric forklifts, a lot more, EVs on the road. And for anyone who has an EV, it's going to be a lot easier to charge, which is going to be very nice.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, one of our core values at FuSE is knowledge is power. And so anything we can do to pass that along internally, externally is going to pay spades for us in the future. Well, Connor, thanks again. As always, Elaine, super grateful for coming on today, dumping knowledge on the regulatory affairs side of things. Appreciate all of your work and your team's work. And thanks for coming on the Charge Cycle.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been an honor.
All right, for everyone else, feel free to reach out if you want to learn a little bit more about any of this stuff. Always happy to connect about these programs, about current updates, or anything else. But until next time, get out there, get plugged in.